Hello, good morning.
Great,
Good
we
morning.
can listen to you perfectly. It's great. This speech will be in English, so I'm going to introduce you briefly. Just name and position, okay? Florian Moslein, he is professor of German civil and business law at the University of Marburg in Germany. He's going to give a speech about, well, the topic is towards machine-readable sustainability. That's a question, okay? Towards machine-readable sustainability, the EU Omnibus Simplification Agenda and the emergence of data-driven sustainability reporting. So it's great to have you there. We said it was very difficult for you to fly to Madrid, so it's great you can connect and you have the floor. Thank you, Professor Mosley.
Thank you so much for both the invitation and this kind introduction. Indeed, it is a great pity that I cannot be with you today. In particular, seeing the new lecture hall you're sitting in, which looks so beautiful, but also, and even more importantly, seeing many dear friends and colleagues sitting in the first row of that lecture hall. I'm really sorry that I cannot be with you in person, but the Lufthansa strike made it impossible to participate this year. Now, instead of planes, let me talk about buses. And in fact, I built my presentation on a recent article that came out in The Economist a few weeks ago. And the headline was, "Can Europe's deregulation drive actually deregulate anything?" And that question underlines what I wanted to argue today. I would like to explore how the European Union's current omnibus simplification agenda should be understood, should be transposed, and should maybe be improved in the field of sustainability regulation. More specifically, I would like to ask whether simplification in European law should be understood mainly as reducing obligations and taking many companies out of the scope, or whether simplification may also mean redesigning regulatory compliance in a more efficient and more meaningful way. Now, my central claim is that the current omnibus agenda in sustainability law simplifies mainly through scope reduction. At the same time, however, the interaction between sustainability law on the one hand and digital regulation on the other hand reveals a second, and I would argue a more durable, more sustainable path of simplification, machine-readable sustainability. In other words, machine-readable sustainability reporting is not merely a technological and technical feature, but it should rather be understood as a distinct form of regulatory simplification. Let me develop this argument in 5 steps. First, I will place the issue in the broader omnibus context. Second, I will explain what I call the simplification paradox. Third, I will show that European law already contains a legal architecture for machine-readable sustainability reporting. Fourth, I will argue that machine readability itself constitutes a form of simplification. And finally, I will conclude with some implementation challenges and a short research agenda. Let me begin with a broader context. The term omnibus no longer describes only a one-off bundle of amendments. It is increasingly becoming a governance technique in European law. In both sustainability law and digital law, the Commission uses a very similar vocabulary: simplification, burden reduction, competitiveness, and better implementation. And this matters because it shows that sustainability reporting should not be analyzed only as a very specialized subfield of corporate governance and company law and maybe capital markets law. But Omnibus is increasingly part of a wider European movement toward a digital standardized and lower friction compliance structure. This development is especially visible in sustainability law. Here it is important to distinguish two different layers. First, there is the so-called stop the clock measure that has already been mentioned several times today, which postpones certain reporting and due diligence timelines. Second, there is the broader and more substantive omnibus reform, which narrows the scope of the CSRD and the CSDDD. This reflects the first and most obvious model of simplification. Fewer companies, fewer addressees, and therefore fewer direct compliance obligations. The quantitative impact of this reform is important, of course. Simplification does not only occur through a narrower scope, it also occurs through a reduction in the content of reporting. In this respect, the EFRAG work on simplifying is particularly relevant because it points towards a substantial reduction in mandatory data points. In addition, there is a stronger emphasis on simplified or voluntary standards for smaller undertakings. So simplification is taking place through two mechanisms: fewer companies covered and fewer reporting data points. At the same time to this sustainability omnibuses, a parallel development can be seen in digital regulation. The digital omnibus reflects a very similar effort to facilitate implementation, reduce compliance costs, and lower regulatory friction. Now, my point is not that digital legislation and sustainability legislation regulate the same subject matters. Of course, they do not. But rather, the important observation is that they now share the same political aims and regulatory grammar. That common grammar is what creates the space for my broader thesis. Sustainability reporting is and should increasingly be transformed into a digital compliance infrastructure. That brings me to what I call the simplification paradox. Narrowing the scope for reporting obligations does not necessarily remove the structural complexity of reporting. For those companies that remain in the scope, many burdens persist. Data collection, internal consolidation, value chain questionnaires, assurance processes, and the repeated reuse of the same information for different audiences. Put differently, the difficulty lies not only in how much information must be reported, but in how information is structured, exchanged, and reused. This is the point where my main argument begins. Sustainability reporting is gradually moving away from a static narrative disclosure and toward a digital information infrastructure. This is why machine readability becomes legally significant. Machine readable reporting means that information is not merely published, it is tagged, it is standardized, it is searchable, and it is reusable. And that is precisely what gives it potential as a form of regulatory simplification. From a legal doctrinal perspective, the most important provision here is Article 29D of the Accounting Directive as amended by CSRD. This provision does not merely refer to electronic reporting, as its title says, but it also requires the markup of sustainability information within that electronic format. That point is crucial. It means that machine-readable sustainability reporting is not simply a future policy aspiration. it is already embedded in positive European law. This legislative choice is then developed through further technical and regulatory layers. The first layer is the taxonomy development. Here, EFRAG's work is essential, especially the ESRS Z1 XBRL taxonomy and also the taxonomy for Article 8 disclosures. These taxonomies translate legally defined reporting requirements into a structured digital language. They function, so to speak, as the grammar of machine-readable sustainability reporting. The second layer concerns filing and technical implementation. This is where ESMA becomes central, in particular through its work on the SF regime and the consultation on sustainability-related markups. One should be cautious about presenting the timeline too categorically, but the direction here is clear, from statutory obligation to taxonomy development to technical filing rules. A further element reaching already beyond sustainability reporting is ESA, the European Single Access Point. Machine readability becomes especially meaningful when data is not only submitted digitally, but also made centrally searchable and reusable. ESA therefore matters because it transforms disclosure from a one-off publication into a part of a wider European infrastructure of accessible, sustainable information and data. In addition, it is useful to look briefly beyond the CSRD framework itself. For instance, the digital product passport and also the interoperability logic of the Data Act are not directly related to sustainability reporting law, but they do reveal a broader regulatory convergence. Across multiple different fields, the European Union is building a legal structure around machine-readable, interoperable, and standardized information. So while we do not yet have a fully closed and seamless information system, we can already speak of an emerging European infrastructure for machine-readable sustainability information. On that basis, I arrive at my normative claim. Machine-readable sustainability is not the opposite of simplification. It is a more convincing form of simplification. If the real administrative burden lies in collecting, reprocessing, and repeatedly transmitting the same information several times, then it is more plausible to standardize and to make that information reusable than simply to narrow the group of reporting companies. One might put this in a simple formula. The current omnibus agenda simplifies by reducing scope. Machine-readable sustainability simplifies by reducing friction. And in the long term, the second strategy may be more durable and a more efficient means of regulatory simplification. It promises not only lower burden for companies, but also better comparability, more efficient reuse, and potentially also smarter supervision. That said, it would be much too easy to end my speech on a purely optimistic note. Machine readability does not eliminate legal questions, of course. It just relocates them. New issues arise in relation to the governance of taxonomies, the updating and versioning of digital standards, interoperability across systems, the assurance of marked up disclosures, and also the treatment of third country information and equivalence questions. Precisely for that reason, machine-readable sustainability reporting is not merely a technical implementation issue, but it is a genuinely legal topic. There is also some sort of distributive challenge. Digitalization may simplify the system as a whole, but it can also shift costs toward actors with weaker technical capacity, especially SMEs and firms in value chains. For that reason, machine-readable sustainability can only count as genuine simplification if it is accompanied by proportional templates, by practical support, and by realistic implementation tools. Otherwise, simplification risks becoming a redistribution of burden rather than a reduction of burden. Now let me conclude. The current omnibus debate should not be framed simply as a conflict between more regulation and less regulation. It should also be understood as a debate about the form of regulation. Simplification can happen through subtraction, that is, through fewer obligations, fewer data points, fewer undertakings in scope. But it can also happen through institutional design by making the remaining obligations more structured, interoperable, and reusable. So my central argument to date has been that machine-readable sustainability belongs to this second category. It is not a marginal technical detail. It is a possible answer to the central problem of how the European Union can reduce bureaucracy without giving up the objectives of sustainability regulation. If the Union wants to simplify while preserving accountability and comparability, then machine-readable, interoperable, and reusable sustainability reporting may be the more convincing path. Thank you very much for your attention.